Everybody who's in the room, thank you so much for coming. I know that there have been train strikes today, so I appreciate the extra effort you've made to get here. And also thank you to everybody online. For those online and in the room, this is going to be a dialogue, so we will have a conversation, but then we will open it up to Q&A. As we're talking, if there are ideas that come to you and you're online, please put those questions in the chat. I'm Louise Quy. I'm the Managing Director of Chemonics UK. Chemonics and Chemonics UK are an organisation that operate in over 100 countries. We have over 6,000 staff, 90% of which work in an area that they call home. Unfortunately, for many of those staff, there is an increasing risk of humanitarian crisis, either due to climate change or due to conflict. And we're here today to talk about ways in which data, technology and research techniques can be deployed to assist in those both preparing for and responding to those humanitarian crises. The UK has an ambitious 2030 vision, and it was clear to Chemonics that the only way that they would be able to achieve that is by really being forward-looking in the ways in which it engages with technology. Before I introduce you to the panel, I've just realised I've got some housekeeping comments, which are, could you put your mobiles on silent? We are not expecting a fire alarm, so if the fire alarm does go off, the stairs are just behind the lifts. Please make your way out, and there's a collection point by the park. I hope that won't happen, but just in case. So I am joined by a very skilled panel here. I would like to introduce Nigel, who is an independent humanitarian consultant, formerly the humanitarian lead for Oxfam. Anna, who joins us from our sister company Connexing, which is a supply chain organisation, is the Director of Operational Excellence. Nice to have you travel all this way here, Anna, thank you. Andy, who joins us from Catapult and is the Geospatial Director. Oh, have I promoted you? You should be. Ruth, who is the Executive Director of the Conflict Research Theory and Practice Consortium, but also leads our research and development team within Chemonics UK. And Roshan Hanna has extensive humanitarian experience and is a Senior Director for Chemonics UK. Thank you all for being here. So I'm going to kick off by asking Nigel our first question, which is your observations as a humanitarian practitioner, Nigel. What are some of the key challenges that can be solved by the use of technology and better evidence and data?
Great. Thanks very much, Louise. Thank you for having me on the panel. It's a really interesting question. I guess the first question that came to mind for me is evidence and data for who? The answer depends really on the stakeholder group. Different stakeholder groups have quite different needs. So for the practitioner, I think questions of efficiency, what's efficient, what's effective, what's practical, what actually works are the kind of key questions they want to know. What's the return on investment? So how do I get the most impact for the least money spent? Especially when I think a lot of us are quite concerned that overall humanitarian budgets are going to be shrinking going into next year. Each sector has its own sort of special needs and concerns. So just as an example, I was involved in a study on global cholera earlier this year. And one of the key issues was the time it takes to confirm that it is actually a cholera outbreak. That can often take a month because of a lack of cholera testing facilities in many countries around the world. During that month, of course, the cholera is spreading. So you're immediately getting a lag built in, which makes addressing the situation harder. So I think speed and trying to minimize delays to allow action, prompt action is key. But then if you looked at a different sector, say like gender and women's rights, then the approaches around, you know, what can you do that's genuinely effective in empowering women? It's a very different data set. It's a very different set of questions. It's a very different type of evidence that you're going to need. I think, as I noted with the cholera example, speed is often key. Even basic facts like how many people are affected can be really important. that number quickly becomes very political. If you're trying to sort of come up to a number to tell the world how many people have been impacted by a particular cyclone, a typhoon, you know, you might find that the government disagrees with you. They think you're saying too many people, or the government actually thinks you're not saying enough. A lot of politics emerges very quickly around scale. So objectivity of data is really helpful. And I think numbers are really important for shifting media interest. And media interest shifts everything else. Speed comes from better preparedness and anticipation. And I think we need better evidence there as well. So I don't just mean evidence of sort of hazard morphology and likelihood, but what's its impact? And the impact of disasters or impact of hazards depends on the vulnerabilities of different communities, different places. You know, greater resolution on who is actually going to be impacted, how are they impacted, and therefore what can we do to support their capacities to prepare and mitigate and respond to disasters. And I think that's going to be really key in developing innovative finance solutions. So as there's more and more interest in the insurance sector and parametrics insurance, having more granular knowledge on that is going to make a big difference to possibility of those innovative finances. Couldn't sort of not mention AI, and I think there's an interesting question around foresight and accurate scenario modeling. So is there a chance not just to model the hazards, the disasters, but how people behave, how people react, and therefore how we can help them in a way that they most want to be helped? You know, in the humanitarian sector, we have a tendency to derive solutions that work for us, the classic one being putting displaced people into camps. We know there are many, many flaws with camp-based solutions. So wouldn't it be better if we could have data and evidence that helps households make decisions at their level for them and their particular situation? Related, I'm doing some work with ELRA at the moment, and when talking to a lot of national civil society actors, their desire for evidence is often systemic. The humanitarian sector tends to be based around sectors like cholera, so health, nutrition, wash, those sorts of things. But often national and local actors are more interested in place-based evidence and the interconnectedness between different issues. So how does the future of climate change, agriculture, and market development all work together? What does that mean? What are going to be the impacts for them in that particular case? And I was involved in a study with humanitarian outcomes on the Ukraine response, where there were environmental researchers who, with the onset of war, wanted to know how is the war impacting the environment. And they found it very frustrating that when they talked to the humanitarians only wanted to talk about wash or displacement or shelter, because they wanted to talk about what the impact was on the environment. So being more connected, I think, is an interesting area for data and evidence. I'm nearly done. I think there's a big issue around access to data and access to knowledge. Most research and innovation is funded by globally north-based actors who tend to fund globally north-based research institutions and universities. So how easily can the affected communities, if we want them to be empowered to be the agents of their recovery, how do they get access to the data and knowledge? How do we make it accessible? I don't just mean in terms of English language, for example, but just the simplicity of the language. Even as a native English speaker, I often find some evidence really quite hard to understand what it's really telling me. And then finally, a personal view is, I think, the most important but most challenging area to get more evidence around is how to affect behaviour change. We've all lived through COVID. We all saw how challenging it is to actually get people to change behaviours and to believe the evidence. Having evidence of itself does not necessarily lead to action. So evidence around how to make that bridge would be super helpful.
Well, I'm sure we'll come back to many of those points, Nigel. Thank you. I am interested to ask you, you mentioned the importance of objectivity of data and the focus on global north-based data. Implicit in that are you saying you think if there's more data that's coming from the global south and is owned by the global south, that it will be more objective or just more helpful?
No, I wasn't trying not to say that so much as I think it's two separate issues. I think objectivity is important. So I think realistically that probably means being able to triangulate, to having multiple sources of data and sort of refute different narratives. I think the point about global south is often what we choose to research tends to be things that help us. So if we're interested in winning funding for our institute, and our institute has particular priorities, so I used to work for Oxfam. Oxfam does a lot of WASH, so inevitably I'm incentivized to look for research funding for WASH. Well, actually, the communities where we're working, WASH might not be their biggest issue. They might want to talk about other things. So I think if you get different researchers, they may ask different questions.
Understood. And that's a really good. Thank you. And very much plays into the localization, which Chemonics is so passionate about. Lots of discussion of data. Anna, data is absolutely critical to what you do. Can you talk about how data has really helped shape supply chains and make sure that and what does good data look like?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So we know that in an emergency, every day counts. So sometimes even every minute counts. From a supply chain perspective, even a day's delay in our delivery of goods can prolong suffering. We don't take that lightly. So we've got to be as efficient as possible. And the question is, how do we use data to become efficient and effective? We do this by applying this concept of operational excellence, which is actually quite common in the private sector, precisely because it's grounded in using data to drive efficiencies in the humanitarian space, where we think it's actually the most needed, even though those two things are commonly associated with each other. And it's really grounded in two pillars. One is planning, and the other is continuous improvement. So planning might seem a bit self-explanatory. We cannot wait for an emergency to decide what our supply chain strategy is going to be, how data is going to play a role in it, and importantly, which data points we're going to collect, right? So we've most recently done this on the Partnership for Resilient Ukraine program. Rather than waiting, we've sat with our logistics partners and instead of having the teams working in silos and doing their best job to coordinate under pressure, we developed a joint process with them, thinking through all the various scenarios and what the step-by-step approach for execution would be, and who would be best positioned to carry out each step of that process. And then we thought through, what are the common performance standards we want to hold ourselves to, us and our logistics partners? We did this talking with our local teams to get their view of what's happening on the ground and guide the targets. This is great because it provides clarity and it allows us to hold each other accountable. And this is really what I credit with letting us hit the ground running and getting 100% on-time delivery out of the gate on that project. And finally, how are we going to collect that data? We would love it if all data collection could be automated. We know that the closer we get to the last mile, the less possible that becomes. So how critical is the data that we need, and what will be our workaround if we cannot get it? So all of this was applied under PFRU. We discussed the supply chain strategies, processes, metrics, data collection methods. Everything was set in place so that every link in the supply chain could respond efficiently when called upon. And that kind of helped us stall off some false starts, unnecessary mistakes that are common when you're dealing with a supply chain and you have multiple partners that having to collaborate to get the result. Now, all of this is important because it also becomes the foundation for continuous improvement. Collecting data just to have the data, it doesn't benefit anyone. And at the same time, we can't improve on what we're not measuring. We can't improve if we don't know how we're performing ourselves. So we know that ultimately, the more efficient we are, the faster our beneficiaries get the assistance they so need on the ground. And so that creates an incentive for us to keep improving, even when we're within the targets. Where can we save even more time so that we can improve our performance? But believe me, this does not just happen organically. There really has to be a top-down intention and a culture built around the teams in the supply chain coming together to look at the data and look at it critically with examining their own performance. So, if there is an area where things are not working well, at one point our on-time delivery was at 70%. Let's sit with the logistics partners, the suppliers, see what's driving the inefficiency and bring it back to 100% where it is today. So the only way to really address those kinds of questions and issues is to and keep the processes feeling alive is to have those regular data reviews, bring the teams together, look at what's working well, what's not working well. And
can I ask about that, Anna? What kind of data metrics are you looking at? Is it you know, is it
Great
routes?
question.
Is it time to deliver it? Like what are the criteria that really helped that humanitarian response to improve and be effective?
Great question. So in supply chain, there are several standard metrics, on-time delivery, in full delivery, right? But then as we work with our suppliers and partners, we also discuss with them based on the needs on the ground, what standards do they need to hold themselves accountable to? So for our suppliers, we've agreed additional on-time availability, because we know that if the suppliers are late in making goods available, that's going to create a knockdown effect on our logistics partners, who will then have to do double duty to deliver things on time on the ground. We also have defective goods rates. The worst thing that can happen is delivering goods that then arrive and can't be used on the ground or arrive with quality issues. So we track incidents and we resolve them. We have a group that does root cause analysis and defines corrective actions or preventive actions when needed. And we look at rework. So we do not want rework to happen in our process. There's so much in emergencies that are out of our control that we absolutely have to try to be best and improve on what we can control, right? So everything that's within our control that is standardized, we try to measure. And that's what we bring into these monthly discussions with the teams.
Yeah, super. Andy, can I move over to you? Nigel mentioned vulnerabilities of different communities, and I'm interested to know how satellite technology can be utilised to really ensure that when you're working out those supply chain routes, you're getting the goods and the responses to those people and those communities that need it the most.
Thank you. I actually have a few slides, so hopefully they work. Oh, magic. Thank you. Hi everyone. My name's Andy. I'm with the satellite application at Caspol, but because I don't get enough maps and data in my work life, I'm also volunteer with Map Action, which is a not-for-profit organisation that provides geospatial expertise for preparedness and humanitarian emergencies. So satellite Earth observation and geospatial is a great tool. I'm slightly biased, but it's a great tool for practitioners and decision makers. And I just wanted to quickly highlight some of the advantages of using it and some of the use cases where it's.
Andy, can I stop you? Can everyone at the back hear Andy? No.
Oh, sorry, I'll talk louder.
And I think you need to speak
straight out.
Yes, that's it.
Oh,
Thanks.
so satellite Earth observation is a fabulous resource, and we're going through a period of sort of innovative disruption at the moment. There are new sensors, new satellites, and new technologies being produced all the time. If we combine that with cloud computing, it really is quite an exciting time. It's becoming more accessible, and there's lots of barriers to entry being broken. Some of the advantages of using satellite technology in this sector are things such as the global coverage that it has. We have the ability to be able to see anywhere in the world using satellite, wherever your area of interest might lay. It has a great historical archive. Data from satellites dates back for about the 1970s. And then we also have the ability to task new images. So we can look for the latest image over your area of interest to try and provide some evidence of what's going on the ground. One of the things that surprises people is that it's actually quite cost effective. And it's a question that we get asked quite a lot. But actually with modern resources and automation techniques, it is actually a cost-effective and scalable solution. Of course, there are downsides. There are a few negatives using it. The first one being that it requires a certain amount of analysis to make it usable, which sometimes requires specialists. And it needs to be really combined with other data sources. Satellite imagery is at its best when it's combined into data layers. So you can combine it with on-the-ground research, field data, it could be open source tools or other geospatial data sets, but that's when it really sinks. Before I give you too many examples, I just wanted to highlight a fantastic resource that's out there. The UK Humanitarian Innovation Hub recently funded a piece of work that Caribou Space produced with others, and it's looking at the current state of play of satellite applications in the humanitarian sector across the entire disaster cycle. So they produced a report, and sitting alongside that report is a catalogue of, excuse me, I had a hold up before I joined, it's a mistake, is a catalogue of 500 applications that are currently out there and exist around the world. It's really a good resource, and one that I highly suggest you go and look at. Those catalogue items, they are existing, they are Earth observation related, but they also look at sustainable development, humanitarian emergencies. So please, there's QR code on the screen for the report, and then the catalogue can be found at the Space for Development website as well. To give you a couple of practical examples, satellite technology can be used for a great variety of solutions. The top left, northwest, is looking at IDP camps. So it's a very high resolution satellite image, and it's being used with automated methods to try and identify and locate IDP camps. This is a very well-known technique, and it's one that can be done and repeated over as new images are provided, which is excellent for camp management. It's great for trying to target resources and to make most efficient use of funds. If we look to sort of the bottom left of the screen, in relation to Nigel's point earlier around cholera, there's a piece of work that was done by the University of Florida. Give me a microphone. Piece of work done by the University of Florida, and it was looking at a number of different data sets that included satellite Earth observation, particularly precipitation and temperature data. It combined it with medical data from the ground, and with that they're able to produce a cholera risk looking at the next 4 weeks. But it's something that's repeated elsewhere, so not just in Yemen, and it really kind of helps to kind of understand the leading risk, what's the risk to the population, but also to aid workers on the ground. The top example is kind of highlights some of that data layering. So underneath there is a flood prediction that relies on the use of satellite data to create that model and to run, but it's at its best when it's combined with the infrastructure data on top of it, so that decision makers can see where the impact of flood could be, but also make decisions based on what could be affected by the flood event, whether that be hospitals, medical facilities, or even the evacuation centres. Bottom behind me is the last example I just wanted to run through, which is looking at how we can make efficient use of funds. So here we're using an open source satellite called Sentinel-1, which looks at SAR data, so it's not in the optical wavelength, but we've created a composite. So those bright pixels on the screen, it's either geology or they're man-made objects, mostly trucks. So we're looking for fuel trucks, essentially, or it could be humanitarian aid trucks. But we wanted to task a satellite to identify this was the route we're after, but we wanted to know where to look. So we use Sentinel-1 satellite to try and find that cluster of bright pixels that you might just be able to see over my shoulder. And from that, we're then able to sort of queue up the satellite to task a high resolution optical satellite. And we can confirm that they are fuel trucks and that they seem to be stopping at this point, either because it's a checkpoint or because it's a bit like a service station. I'm going to try and briefly give you an example of how these can all be combined and sort of practical on the ground uses. So this is an example from sort of Map Action. Map Action deployed a team out to Libya as part of the floodings that happened there in September of this year. And as part of their arsenal, they make use of products that are readily available from people such as the UN Satellite Centre. So they frequently, after an event, make products such as flood extents and damage assessments available. And people such as myself and Matt can then combine these into usable maps for decision makers on the ground to best target the aid, target delivery, and make efficient decisions. As part of my job at the Catapult, we're also looking at what's next, what's on the horizon, what can we make use of from other sectors within the humanitarian sector. And so these are just some of the things that we're interested in at the moment, whether it be high resolution thermal imagery or whether it be automatic automatic processing on the satellite. These are just some of the things that we're also interested in, and I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. It might be worth passing the mic to Ruth because my next question is for her, and I just don't know how good the pickup is. So Ruth, Andy just talked about what satellites can do, but really how important it is to combine what you can obtain from satellites with other evidence. And I'm really interested to hear from you, based on the work that you've done on Accept, what kind of evidence can really ensure that our humanitarian responses are more effective?
Thank you, Louise. Let me see if you can all hear me without the mic. No, okay. So the three speakers so far, you all touched upon points I was going to raise, so I'll modify a little bit because we don't want to repeat, we want to get to discussion. And I agree with many of the points that were raised and just want to add a few further ideas. I come to you from a conflict analysis background, conflict research background, the cross-border conflict evidence policy and trends program. Really, the team is here. We really think about conflict drivers across borders, its impacts and implications across borders and across regions. Often where we're working are are locations that are also desperately in need of humanitarian assistance. And they are locations where you often have compound crises, where a rapid onset crisis occurs in a place where there's been protracted conflict. I also want to talk to you a little bit just with a pure evidence hat on and research hat on. So we'll think a little bit about how these methods can come together, both what should drive the choice, and then considerations about opportunity and risk, because you always have to think not just about ethics, Nigel's point about inclusion, but also about potential risk in using certain methodologies. I think the first question, and Nigel discussed a lot about kind of the context varies, the stakeholders vary, the challenges vary, the research need can vary and it can vary for a rapid onset crisis. It can vary for a protracted crisis where you have seasonal shifts every year, where populations are moving and their needs are evolving, where the conflict developments are changing what's happening on the ground. So we're always thinking about rapid research, but we're also thinking about longer term research. And I think it's important to keep that, it's not so much a distinction, but to keep in mind that you need to be working on multiple layers at the same time. And I would, it was probably one of my concluding points, I would support what Nigel said about we should be thinking beyond the humanitarian research space. We try to be an interdisciplinary research program. I think this is true for evidence in general. We need to be thinking about how you bring different disciplines together to answer complex questions in complex humanitarian emergencies. That means, bringing the humanitarians together with the conflict researchers, with those that are thinking about development assistance, livelihoods, education. There's short-term and long-term. I'm going to give me a moment for a second. There's, of course, just by way of background, satellite applications Catapult are actually working with us on Accept, because as a conflict research program, we knew that it was important to integrate field methods and remote methods together. We are a rigorous, high-quality research program. We, as Chemonics, in terms of research and evidence, support the need for qualitative and quantitative field data collection to the extent that you can. We are aware, however, that in hard-to-access environments, which can be hard to access, whether because there was just a disaster, whether because you're denied access, or simply because there's insecurity, risk, roads are impassable for whatever reason, you need to have alternate methods. It's useful to think about layering methods like this because we're always thinking about rigor, quality and rigor. In the best case scenario, you can do systematic data collection on the ground and be able to bring back a data set that you can work with. Of course, that's not always the case. So using some of these methodologies and thinking about them together can actually help you triangulate. It can help you get rapid insights. I'm going to show you one or two examples. Get rapid insights in an evolving crisis, and even over one where you're just denied access, to begin to understand the ground, what's happening on the ground. And then there's that second piece, which I think is also critical for evidence, which is, and we try as a program, never to just study the problem, but also to do research on the solution. And this is what Anna was talking about as well. And I was writing down notes about the ways that you think about the data you collect and how you analyze it. The primary purpose of we're a UK government funded research program is to think about what works. Those of you that are here are coming from various sectors, and really what we're trying to get to are, Nigel described it as efficient, effective, practical, and with a value for money. I'm going to add scalable, adaptable, and really thinking about the needs of those on the ground. Sorry, I only have my bifocals with me, so I need to keep taking them on and off. The hardest locations in which we work are always those areas of compound crisis. And that is where you, especially when you have the rapid onset crisis on top of the protracted crisis. I thought the example that Andy brought forward about the Libya flood is a really instructive one. It shows you where the damage occurs, but the bird's eye view can't show you necessarily whether people can access services or what the population looks like. And as soon as I saw that picture, I thought about the fact that Libya already was a place of significant displacement. Eastern Libya in particular, there were maybe roughly 8,000 migrants or refugees at least sitting in Derna at the time of this flood in September. So what do we understand about those population needs? I think our picture remains imperfect and inaccurate. We don't always, especially in conflict-affected environments, you don't always have a full picture of who's moving, where they are, and sort of the history of their needs. And I would value today as a dialogue, which is the way Louise described it, that we think together a little bit of how those different elements come together. The second, compound crisis example that really shook me, because I come from a background of working on Syria, was that earthquake earlier this year in Turkey and northern Syria, where it was occurring in a space that no one could really, it was very difficult to access in parts of Syria that had been affected for years. 1 minute, what did we do for research? We kind of tried to look at, do an evidence synthesis, looking at other contexts and asking ourselves what we learned. So now I'm just going to very quickly show you some examples about how we do our work, which I think also relate to the humanitarian space. So again, this is how Accept uses remote methods. There's a body of open data, and we try to always bring it together, whether it's social media or news. There's the Earth observation that Andy was talking about so eloquently. There's another piece that we haven't really talked about yet, which is signals data, anonymized, GPS, what's on your phone. This is really interesting because it can tell you where people are going and how they're moving. And that's critically important, I think, in a humanitarian response context, with some cautions about risk. And of course, there's the field data. Very quickly, one example that was really a test case from a long time ago that we tried in Ukraine, and it'll give you the example of how these things layer. Take Google traffic data, tells you what's happening along a road. Add satellite imagery along that same road, shows you trucks lined up trying to get past a crossing point between a conflict-affected area and an area you can access. And then GPS data that kind of tells you how vehicles are moving up and down a roadway. This can tell you about supply chain, whether you can get in and out of a place, whether people are moving, goods are moving in and out. It can also tell you, if you think about it in a different configuration, where populations may be fleeing to, where they're congregating. I'm going to turn this off, or you could take this down for a moment. Because I want to very quickly note the risk about that. We've thought a lot about the use of these methods together. You want to layer them because it improves quality, it improves rigor, it improves insight, it helps us think about how to utilize new methods alongside the traditional methods. You want to make sure you are never putting populations at risk. This satellite imagery, we're thinking about it together collectively as a resource to help us understand needs and how to serve. There are those that might be looking at targeting, and you want to be very careful about populations on the ground. They could be at risk. I like Nigel's point, and I would echo it very strongly. Think about equality of access. These tools are sometimes sitting in the hands of those of us that are sitting in the global north. Make them accessible to those working in the global south. Absolutely make them accessible, both the data and the methods and the capabilities to use them to those that are locally based on the ground, because when you have a protracted crisis, they're the ones that are there for an extended period of time. This can be researchers, this can be CSOs, this can be NGOs, this can be local governments. It's great. We should think about how to ensure everyone can use these tools. I can't remember who said it, maybe it was Andy who said it. They're ever more effective. They're ever more accessible and available. I'm going to take just 20 seconds more. I know you're showing me the time, just to say very quickly one or two other things. I work in the research and evidence space. Let's always think about research. You want rigor. Sometimes you have to think about piloting something that may not have those traditional frame of rigor, but it gives you a layer to triangulate and test. So let's do some testing. Let's think beyond just the academic research space. Let's think about the private sector space. Think about how you bring civil society actors and other actors together so that you are a little bit agile and innovative in terms of how we employ these methods. And my final point would be one that echoes Nigel, which is uptake. Evidence uptake is critical. We always think about the variety of audiences. There's never just one product, outcome of your research. You want different pieces for different actors, those in the field, those in capitals, those who are implementers, those who are experts, and we should all be coming together routinely to sort of dive into each of the questions or points that we're all raising to keep, pushing the envelope further. Thanks.
I love that, Ruth. I love that enthusiasm for innovation. It's great to see. Roshan, Ruth has talked about risk. I'm really interested to get your perspective, also as a practitioner, on the risks and also the advantages of adopting some of these more innovative approaches.
Thanks, Louise, for that. I mean, I think Ruth has kind of spoken really well about some of the perils that we can see from the data. And for me, it's really about thinking about the type of data we're collecting, and do we actually need to collect it? Have we thought through what the implications of that might be? So even before we have the data, to think through some of those questions, and would that data be accessible to those that are a party to the conflict, or even others, and how that would impact coming out. But I think that's probably one of the most important perils that I would see in this. I think the other area as well, both kind of, Andy, Ruth have spoken to, which is around using satellite data, but layering that, and that satellite data in itself, and a lot of what we're talking about in itself, doesn't necessarily disaggregate for us sufficiently to be able to allow a response that is targeted towards the needs of different people that are affected. So how do we then bring in those different layers to ensure that the type of data that Andy was talking about through satellite technology can actually allow us to develop an informed humanitarian program, and not just taking that at face value. I think, I'm really, in terms of kind of the advantages and benefits, I'm so excited about everything that I've heard today from you all, and what that kind of really means for the way humanitarian programming can pan out in the future. One of the real things is around kind of Earth observation. I think we're all really keenly aware of the benefits of that for how we design responses, particularly with climate change and the kind of humanitarian emergencies we're seeing now directly because of climate change, the kind of intensity of some of those impacts that we're seeing, whether they're fires, or whether they're floods that are emerging, whether it's kind of the winds, the storms, the hurricanes that are developing. So I think Earth observation has a real potential to help us anticipate those types of emergencies and how we can better prepare and respond to them. I think as well, I'm really excited by what Andy was saying around kind of monitoring precipitation and temperatures and how that can help us plan better for cholera outbreaks, perhaps even before disease early warning mechanisms on the ground are able to spurn out that data. We can have these kind of monitors giving us that information before that early warning mechanism on the ground kicks off and allow us to really contain an outbreak before that data comes out even within on the ground. So I think that's great, but I'm also excited about how that kind of monitoring around precipitation and temperature can actually help us with other things like understanding locust infestations and when the right conditions might be in place to for locusts to breed and to develop. And we've seen, as humanitarian worker, I've seen the devastating impact that a swarm of locusts can cause across countries, even across regions. Within a matter of minutes, they can destroy a whole farmland, all crops, and that's the food source for that community, for that household gone. It can prolong the lean season within a region. It can lead to a lot of food insecurity and nutritional kind of interventions needed. So if we can use and deploy technology like that to help us understand whether there will be a locust swarm coming in and be able to preempt that by maybe covering crops and protecting them, I think that would be amazing and really beneficial. I think just another thing that I wanted to raise as well was just around, the real kind of benefit I see from all of this is around machine learning and how we can use all of this Earth observation data and other information data coming out from satellite technology to kind of understand what's happening and combine that over the years through how those conditions then impact on the ground. And if we can kind of collect all of that, we'll be in a position where we can better understand the humanitarian impact of what these conditions mean on the ground. And with that, we can really be able to plan better for a response, and not just plan better for a response, but we'll be able to build up the evidence for a serious investment in preventing a hazard from ever developing into a humanitarian crisis. And for me, I think that's the real benefit from all of this technology, to be able to prevent a crisis ever happening.
Super. Thank you. So I said at the beginning I'd like it to be a dialogue. I really would like it to be a conversation and to hear what ideas there are in the room and online. Are there any questions coming in from online at Cancer or in the room? If you have a question, please put your hand up or a comment. Yeah. I think Louise is coming with a mic.
Hello, my name is Mustafa Sofia. I'm the Humanitarian Policy Advisor at BOM. I think this is using technologies that flourish and a promising thing in serving humanitarian. So my question is about the cost of using technology. So now the beginning mentioned that humanitarian budgets being shrunked and how we can overcome this obstacle. And my second question is about the complexity. Also, Nigel mentioned that it's not a language. The English language shouldn't be complex, should be easy. And one of my concerns about using the technology, always it comes with a lot of complexity, especially with local organizations, as many of us are advocates for localization. How we can also overcome these things, how we can make the technology very simple for people in the field and very small villages in Yemen or in Syria. Thank you.
So I'm just going to repeat the question because I know it's not always picked up online. So the question was really about the cost you know, how can we meet the cost of some of this technology, and then also ways in which we can simplify it so that the very communities that Nigel talked about at the beginning have access to this, and it helps them to be able to make informed decisions. Does anyone from the panel want to put themselves forward as an immediate response to that? No.
I might.
Okay, go ahead, Ruth.
It's about the point about simplifying. I know just in some of our work, again, this is not necessarily, our research is not immediately about crisis response, humanitarian response. It's about conflict response, but it uses these methods. And we have tried in some of our work to ensure, you know, we weaving in, and this is actually work I think the Catapult did in East Africa, where they were looking at, we're doing research on pastoralism and the movement of groups along the Kenya-Uganda border. And they were looking at water resources and using the Earth observation to really understand, and Andy will be able to describe it better, what was happening to water resources in the area in which pastoralists were moving. I don't really think that when it came down to working with, and this was community action research, you know, the communities themselves were undertaking field data collection and community data collection, and also we're looking at this sort of satellite data. There wasn't actually a translation problem. What there was what you really need to do is figure out how useful it could be. There was an application question. If you're doing this work, and I think Nigel might have noted it earlier when you said we sometimes sit in the north and define the question. If the question is generated from the global south, it might actually be a different question. So I believe that there's always ways to transfer capacity, build capacity, ensure that those that are in to localize the research, the methodologies and techniques and make them usable for those that are on the ground. Think about what their actual needs are. There were some in those community action groups that said, I'm not sure the satellite data is telling me something I didn't already know by word of mouth, and years of moving back and forth and village to village communications. So I think we just continually have to test ourselves. My primary point is the shiny object shouldn't guide your work. It should be the evidence need. And I think that's critical. And there's always a way to make the outputs of all this work speak to those who need to utilize it.
I think that's very important. Thank you for localized technology. I think this is something we need to work along in.
Yeah, I think I'll take the cost point then. So from my own experience of the Ukrainian response, the response to the Ukraine war, I think that some of this technology that we now have would have been really beneficial to support coordination and prevent duplication. And so I think there's two things to say is one, you know, if you can use this technology to prevent in the way that Roshan talked about, prevent extreme famines, clearly that's going to be a significant cost saving. But the second point is a lot of these technologies can really enable data to be shared really, really effectively, which means that the overall cost of the response goes down.
Maybe if I could add on to that as well, I think part of the cost thing is for me a leadership question. So I think there's a when budgets get tight, there's a tendency to get conservative. You kind of protect the core products, whatever the core product is. Whereas actually, you know, it was Hillary Clinton said, you know, never waste a good crisis. What are the opportunities for convening and collaboration and breaking down some of the barriers between our organisations so that the cost of new approaches is spread across multiple organisations, and rather than each organisation feeling, right, well, I've just got to cut my cloth to fit, look for the opportunities for connections and sharing the cost burden. But that takes brave leadership, because often leadership feels under pressure to minimise the hit to their department.
Thank you.
Hi, yeah, I'm just interested to know if the panel is aware of any efforts on standardisation in terms of even requirements for data sets and harmonization. So the data sets become useful immediately following disaster event.
Interesting questions. I'll just repeat it for the participants online. Is there a drive to standardise data and the way in which we collect it so that it can be more effectively used? Yes, Andy.
Great. That one.
I could do.
Great question. And I've got a good example. Just 1 second to explain. The Turkey Syria earthquake. Map Action deployed a team to the field and were inundated with really great data sets. Unfortunately, they had 3 or 4 building damage assessments, and you just don't know who to use. So it's a really difficult situation to be in. And it's a great point about standardization. Standardization is really important. I know that the OGC at the moment have a call out for standardization of climate and disaster data. So there are efforts being made to standardize data, and people such as UN Satellite Centre provide products in a standard format and publicize them on things like the Humanitarian Data Exchange. So there are efforts being made, but it could greatly improve because, you know, even using different data formats is a nightmare when you're in the field.
It's in my experience with the Global Health Supply Chain project for USAID, there was a huge effort there to standardize the way that key performance indicators were measured and defined across all of the countries so that we could actually compare efforts and see where additional improvements were needed. So I think also true in the supply chain space, and as supply chain platforms become more ubiquitous, then, you know, there's less of a need to define and manually collect and more automation.
Who is driving that standardization?
So in the example of the Global Health Supply Chain project in particular, there is a centralized team that works with the on the ground M&E teams, monitoring and evaluation teams. So it's a partnership between centralized data collectors and scientists and local staff.
Maybe I could just on the same point, but just a shout out for a unit called the Integrated Outbreak Analytics, which is a unit hosted by UNICEF in Democratic Republic of Congo. And a large part of their thesis is good enough data, certainly for decision making. Like sometimes we can get very focused on, is it exactly the right data? Whereas actually once you've got 2 or 3 data sets and they're telling you a narrative, make the decision to move, particularly when speed matters. So they're quite interested in being very pragmatic about data. Sorry, Ruth, that's probably a bad word. But
thank you. Have we got any questions online?
Yeah, we've got a couple. So one online question is, do all governments agree with having foreign satellites gathering data on the emergency? Have you encountered any challenges with that?
Question. Andy.
Not sure how best to answer that. So a number of organisations around the world have signed up to the International Disaster Charter, where they can call on help to task satellites after an emergency. So I guess to some extent, yes, because then they have the ability to task should that emergency happen.
Great. Yes.
Hi, my name is Bonnie Chu from the Social Investment Consultancy. We did some work with Bond on locally led development. So on that point, I mean, having worked with local organizations in the humanitarian space, I think their challenges around funding are even more pronounced than development, than organizations working in development space. So they just simply have no capacity on their data systems, and funders are very interested in funding AI and machine learning. I've received funding from Humanitarian Grant Challenge on AI kind of for humanitarian data. But when it comes to actually the funding for these organizations around data collection, having a CRM system, no funders want to fund local organizations of doing that. So can the panel kind of shed light on what do you see in terms of global funders channeling more funding to local organizations in building their data capabilities, or what do you think needs to be done to support really the basics, you know, let alone talking about fancy technology, they just need a computer and someone who can input data onto Excel spreadsheet to start with.
Or a mobile phone, as we're seeing so much data collection being mobile phone led. Do any of the panelists want to contribute to that point?
Can I just make a just a simple observation? Those that are funding, and actually as a research program, we're also funders. There's a fairly straightforward fix to some of this, which is as you're funding, even if you're asking a complex question, you actually write into that call for proposals that you are, you know, or your terms of reference, that there's a requirement for a certain proportion of that award or grant to include local organizations, local researchers. You put them in the lead, and it's going to accelerate the way those that are accepting the funding think about how they structure their approaches to make sure they're actually incorporating those that are on the ground, both in terms of transmitting knowledge and maybe answering some of those more basic needs questions in terms of preparing them to use and utilize some of the methods that we're talking about here.
I suppose a couple of thoughts really. One is I totally recognise what you're saying, and I think it becomes almost a self-perpetuating paradigm, which people say, oh, they don't have enough capacity to do the research, therefore we won't fund them because they don't get the capacity, and you can't just self-replicate the current system. Separately, I think another issue is a lot of the sort of big research grants are, you know, aren't really overseen or controlled by the humanitarian teams in different donors. So as an example, in Europe, the Horizon programme, an enormous research fund, it's like 90 billion euros. ECHO can't use that money because the purposes of Horizon are for the benefits of Europe. And so you have ECHO as a European part of the European Commission, can't actually, I mean, I think it gets a tiddly amount, but it can't really access this research funding. So I think there's partly a campaign to be developed around using some of these big research funds and seeing the opportunity for investment in research capacity globally, and particularly if you make the bridge to sort of issues like climate change and other issues. And there's certainly work going on. I mean, I know, I think it's Sweden, they have a whole program where they fund PhDs in universities in the global south. But the way it's run is it doesn't particularly ask humanitarian issues. It just asks universities in the global south, hey, how do we develop your capacity? Have you got some good PhD things? So there's opportunity, but we're not finding the connections between some of the issues. And so I think if we can, you know, I'm a bit of a fan of collaboration and convening. I think we could overcome some of these barriers. I think there is opportunity there, but we just need to get people who don't normally talk to each other to talk to each other.
Yeah, that's a good point, Nigel. So we have some programs here that are funding universities across the global south to really be thinking about work and research work, but it isn't necessarily humanitarian focused. I would say that we certainly see across our profile an increasing push for USAID and FCDO to engage with local actors and communities, and I think that research and evidence is increasingly going to be part of that.
I think also there's some leapfrogging going on in many of the countries where we're working, where mobile technology has actually replaced some of the need for all of this access to computers. And we're seeing lots of apps on platforms being developed locally and utilised where they can access data about, for example, crops and monitor soil conditions and ideal conditions for planting, for example. So I think there's a lot of leapfrogging going on that changes, you know, how things are being done on the ground in countries as opposed to how we're doing it here.
I mean, I would agree with that. And, you know, we have a partner that works with us on our Ukraine programme that uses quite interesting technology whereby local citizens can be part of the research collection process, using their mobile phones to share real-time data in return for small amounts of funding that goes directly to their mobile phone. So I think there's some really interesting changes that we're seeing in the humanitarian response space. Another question online, Katja?
So somebody's asked, in emergencies, what are the steps to ensure that the evidence provided is objective?
Let's take the first step of that. Nigel, do you want to?
I mean, what in the current paradigm, it's hard. I mean, the UN system, if you've got an UNDAC team on ground, they will be working hard to try and triangulate data, use multiple sources to make it as objective as possible. But it's hard. So it's I think there's lots of people using their best efforts, but it's difficult. And I think there's also, I think we're all guilty as people involved in the field, is you also often use data to spin a particular narrative. I don't necessarily mean that cynically. It's just, you know, if you're trying to fundraise or get airtime for a particular crisis, then you will use the data to maximize that. So getting truly objective, boring data is hard, I would say, particularly in the
and at speed.
And speed in the chaos, yeah.
Because there's always that tension and triangulation, but also getting the speed that you need to get the support to enable the response.
So I know that in humanitarian responses, you often have the clusters set up through the UN mechanism, and those clusters are supposed to actually be the source of statistics and data that sector then utilizes to design the response. And as a humanitarian worker, we've often gone to the cluster to verify information on the ground and check what we're finding on the ground with what the cluster is saying. So I think that's the point of the clusters being established, where different actors come together within that cluster, agree the data that's emerging from there, and present that to others to design the programming from. It doesn't always work, but that's the approach through the clusters that's supposed to help with that.
And it's the same thing for the cross-functional data reviews I mentioned as part of continuous improvement. The point is to have the different stakeholders together in the room looking at the data and looking at it not in a punitive way, but if something, isn't going according to plan, what can we do about it? And if we can set that expectation that, we're gonna take the data as it is, not to further an agenda, then maybe we can, it will lessen the incentive to present bad data or at least inaccurate data going forward.
And one further thought, because it's a really tough question. And all the answers so far, I absolutely agree with. So we as a community are thinking about, these are hard, difficult to access environments. It's how do you get from the ground the data that you need to inform your response? You pull together all the approaches that we can, both traditional and new, and you do this triangulation. But the thing I think we sometimes beginning to forget is that it requires us also not merely to ask whether the picture we're getting is objective, but are we stripping out and sort of pushing aside the noise, because we are all distracted by a lot of noise and manipulation and other sources of information that bombard us. So that there's an element of self-discipline in terms of figuring out your best response in terms of how you collect your data and analyze it, and not becoming too swayed by the multiplicity of sources of other information coming at us.
Yeah, thanks, Louise.
I'm interested that people are talking a lot about citizens using data and locally based organisations. But obviously in humanitarian responses, there's the education cluster, there are other clusters where kind of governments need to be taking decisions using evidence. For example, if there's going to be more climate migration and unplanned, how do you decide how long children have been out of school? How do you decide what is a good out of school or a catch-up programme? these are all requiring evidence, and I don't know if we're hearing enough about how to engage governments who might be used to using evidence or might not want to.
The governments should be leading the cluster, so they should be working with the UN organization, UN and other organizations to lead that cluster. So the idea is that they then take ownership of the data and the information emerging from the cluster and act on it. So in an ideal situation where the government has the capacity to do that, they would be leading on that data and presenting it and responding and utilizing it.
And then you need the alternative approach when the government either doesn't have the capacity or doesn't have the will. So you just have to be working from both ends of that equation.
I wanted to just hone in a little bit on data. When we try and combine such broad-reaching topics, sometimes it's interesting to hone in on one. So I'm going to try. And at least in my view, and in the view of many people I work with, the current paradigm in humanitarian response around data is one of extraction, whereby principally we draw information from communities, individuals, regardless of whether it's through household surveys, satellite technology, and then use that data to inform our response. We put it in the meat grinder of the humanitarian system and then churn out what is often described as the mincemeat of our programming. And I'd be interested to hear views on how we can shift to a new paradigm, which is far less extractive and more constructive. And by constructive, I mean such things as data no longer being the means through which, or the provision of data no longer being the gateway for the receipt of assistance. I mean, for example, a paradigm in which people have the right to privacy, that they own their own data and provide it when necessary and when appropriate and based on their own choice, but not, as I said, as the means or the reason why they receive assistance. And also ultimately, as I think has been touched upon by many of the panelists and many of the questions, that data, is valuable beyond the humanitarian system and as it exists. It's useful to local organizations, it's useful to local people. And how do we ensure that data and data needs are determined first and foremost by people, and that they have the information that they need to make fundamental decisions, rather than it just being about strengthening the humanitarian system. So how do we move from extraction to a new paradigm, which is about data ownership, a right to privacy, and use and availability of data within local communities?
Super, thank you. Sorry, what was your name? Ed. Ed, that was a great question, Ed. So how do we move from the extractive use of data to data ownership was the question. And I think it was implicit in some of the comments around risk, the risk of too much data being held and possibly not being held by the right parties. Does anyone want to go first in a response to that?
I can have a stab. Sorry, I seem
Yeah,
to be talking a lot.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a very good point, well made, and I think it's going to remain difficult because data is power, and the thing about humanitarian settings is there's lots of people trying to exert power in one way or another. It might not be for cynical reasons, it might be for cynical reasons, but so I think there's going to be a level of there's bound to be a level of extraction, because that's how if you're going to try and get a picture of what's going on, you have to extract the data from somewhere. So I think to some extent there has to be a level of extraction. But I think in terms of your point about balance and how that data is handled, managed, treated currently, that balance is out of whack. So I'm totally with you on that one. And in my opening remarks, I sort of made the point that if we could move to a situation where we're actually enabling households to make household level decisions, so that it's about data empowering. So I mean, I've been very positive about the shift to more and more cash and voucher-based programming, where you're actually allowing people to make choices about how the resources are used themselves rather than relying on others. And I think some of the commitments to sort of more social protection and emergency-based social protection, again, is sort of to be welcomed. In terms of the sort of data protection stuff, I mean, it might feel like a bit of a cop-out answer, but it goes back to preparedness. Try and do any of this stuff in the sort of heat of the moment, it's going to be nigh on impossible. You know, even educating people about what data they have, their rights and entitlements around data, what the legislative framework is around data within many of these countries. You know, it's all over the place. So you're not going to fix any of that in a humanitarian crisis. So for me, these are issues of disaster preparedness, development, you know, risk-informed development. I think one of the frustrations is how we tend to have this rather simplistic notion of the sort of development, then you have a crisis, things go wrong, then you get better and you go back onto development. It's just not that simple. Actually, having development that is cognizant of the hazards and the risks within an environment and thinks about that within the development paradigm is, to me, sort of the holy grail, which we seem to struggle to get to. But if you had those kind of conversations, then you could have conversations about, okay, what are the hazards? What's the data we're going to need to mount an effective response? Then how do we educate the population on, you know, about that data and how to handle it, and then put in place the right legislative framework as well. Those are all things that are going to take time and have to be done outside the context of an actual response, mindful of the response that will come.
Maybe at the, yeah. Yeah, it's the people online that will need you to be.
Hi, I'm Bev Angelo, Commercial Director of Programmes from FCDO. So I thought it'd be good just to comment on some of the points from a sort of donor perspective, and I do have a question as well. So most people will be aware we've launched a white paper recently, this International Development White Paper. And I was at a development conference last week where we spent 2 weeks talking about how we're going to deliver that white paper, because it's not just a white paper, we've got to do something with it. So I just wanted to pick up on some of the points because I think it's relevant from humanitarian and wider development, but also what we're talking about in terms of data and technology. So on the localization side, this came through really strongly in the white paper, and it was discussed. It sort of dominated the conversation at a conference last week. And for all good reasons, that it's the right thing to do, and there's a real opportunity. I think coming back to one of the points it made earlier, probably traditionally, and sometimes fund things, we don't think about funding the basics or the elements that are needed to really deliver what needs to be delivered. So I think we will have to change as a donor how we sort of construct, how we fund programmes, particularly when there's local organisations we want to have stronger partnerships with. What also came through in the white paper was partnership. And this is not just about partnership with suppliers and NGOs and local partners. It's also how we work with the governments, so our beneficiaries, all the different countries that we work with. And it's very much about having a more equitable relationship. So a lot of the things touched upon here of data and being open and collaborative and sort of, I guess, working through where there might be disagreements about how we want to deliver, whether it's sustainable development or sort of aid. I think one thing's really worth important highlighting data. I love data. I previously have a science background, but I've also come on the negative end of data. When I worked in COVID, there was a lot of things misrepresented. So I've got a really strong passion for data, but that it needs to be represented the right way. But I think what we often neglect is the people consuming that data and having the insight and confidence to actually understand and disseminate the different data that is being presented to them. Everyone likes a really interesting, exciting narrative, but it's not necessarily the sort of true picture. So I think we can't neglect actually how people consume data, and that's not just your general, you know, the citizens of the country or globally. It's even in organisations. We've got a big drive within FCDO at the moment to make people more and more engaged in understanding data, how they use it to make decisions. So there's sort of quite a lot to sort of unpack there, but I just wanted to sort of give a different perspective from the organisation that I'm in. The question that I do have, And it feels like a bit of a holy grail, and it's great some of the things that have been touched upon here, how we can have lots of different sources. But I'm particularly interested in how we use different sources of data or intelligence on the predictive elements. So we touched a little bit on, for example, the locust example, but even broader than that, we live in a really complex environment where I can't remember, there was a term you say, like polycrisis, that's how we are now. But how do we sort of pull lots of different data to sort of predict potential crises, whether it's humanitarian or conflict? How do we get to that holy grail position where we are being more predictive and preventative than reactive?
Great, thank you, Bev. So just to repeat that last question then, how can we be more predictive and less reactive? And I'm going to ask you that question, Ruth, because I think you've got some good insights to bear.
I wanted to say, I don't think we've cracked that nut yet. And it's a question we think about all the time because we're asked it a lot, especially because we work on a conflict research program, and we're always trying to think about how to move from conflict reduction and mitigation and resolution toward the spectrum of conflict prevention. So the concept of prediction is important. In a complex crisis, and I'm just being perfectly honest, like we're still struggling with the different ways you have to think about the inputs that you need to understand. And then the ways somebody asked this question about systematizing, data, how making sure you're asking all the right questions, near term, midterm, long term. You've structured your approach well enough to be able to do this early warning risk analysis that isn't merely just monitoring, monitoring what's, for example, we love ACLED data, but ACLED data just tells you about patterns of violence. It's not necessarily going to give you the true predictive element to be able to identify something. It could tell you where something's escalating, but it's not really toward the prediction that you're talking about. I think the best we're going to do right now is to try to identify which layer of the crisis we're really focused on at the moment, or maybe which two layers or aspects. Identify the research questions or evidence questions and needs we need to be sort of tracking in order to make sure we are looking ahead, and then start early. I think it was Nigel who said, if you're going to do research and collect data, you can't always think about it in the heat of the moment or when the crisis strikes. You've got to think about how good and accurate is what you have before you even get to when you're at the point of fragility, but not at the point of instability. I just think we have to be lengthening our time horizon, kind of working from comparing notes from places that are currently stable to places that are currently unstable. Right now we're doing some work in coastal West Africa and trying to think about those places are not yet unstable, and there's a variety of factors at play. Can you assess them all now before you actually get to the point of instability? So I don't have an obvious answer. I just know that the data questions are complex. This concept of systematizing them so everybody can utilize them, we're not quite there yet. And there is one thing I think we could do better and do it fairly easily, and it's about that consumption point you noted, is we can easily start developing a more common picture and sharing more. And that's true for organizations. It's also very true for governments. And it's about the uptake. If you have an output or a finding, you are presenting it at multiple levels, be it local up to multilateral organizations or policy stakeholders, but we should always be thinking about the conversation between these actors and creating that common picture at multiple levels. So my apologies that I don't have, the perfect answer, but I think it's a nut we're all still working on.
Anyone want to add any points to that? I think I would just, we have a US-based FuseNet program, which has done a lot to try and predict where there might be famine. And that's based at, looking at what exactly as we said, like looking at places where there are famine, what were the predictors there, and then applying those to other countries so that there can be steps taken to prevent before there is a position where there is a real loss of life or livelihood.
You actually reminded me of something that I had wanted to say in my remarks, but I got all muddled. It was about FuseNet and about those, I'm sorry if I always pause when I have to say the IPC, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, and using these remote methods. There was a moment in the middle of the, early in the Ethiopia Tigray crisis when, you know, speaking to some of the organizations that were operating on the ground and also thinking about the World Food Program data, we also tried to look at using the Earth observation and satellite imagery. We took the IPC prediction about how a planting cycle or harvest would unfold, and then look at satellite imagery over time so that you understood, you know, the extent, this is in Tigray, northern Ethiopia, the extent of cropping, and then could you make an assessment on how much was actually harvested, and even and after the harvest cycle, compare that to understand if the IPC prediction was actually on target. Because what they found that year ultimately was that the harvest was better than the IPC had actually predicted. And then thinking forward and using some of that research to ask yourself, how would you assess the needs that arise from comparing the World Food Program data about people's needs on the ground against all the measures that the IPC uses to make that prediction, and then what you could actually see based on planting and then harvest? Where were the bottlenecks? Where did you need to get the, if you're thinking about next year's harvest, what are the things you need to anticipate in terms of getting the resources in order to be able to better prepare a population to make the most of their planting cycle and their harvest cycle? So it's not necessarily your prediction point, but you just spurred it to me that there are, coming back to our point about the technologies, I think we're still experimenting in ways to use them that combine all the methods.
Thank you. We've got last 5 minutes. Are there any more questions online, Akansha? No. So I really wanted to open up, there's lots of good questions that have been asked, and I really wanted to open it up to the people in the room. Are there any responses you would give? You know, the question about, you know, how can we shift the paradigm on data? You know, I'd love to know the ideas of the people sitting here, and if you indeed have an idea to the answer to that.
Expecting it to be turned up.
Louise, do you want to?
Maybe if I could have a minute to think, I'd appreciate that. And then...
Sure.
I'd be interested if anyone had a further insight on the machine learning point and the big data point, and whether you've come across ways to do that better.
Right. Yeah, that's good.
I mean, if I were to answer my own question, I think what my conclusion is after kind of reflecting on this is that we can't expect data and the collection of more data and the processing of that data to resolve broader systemic issues. Data can indeed be a contributor to better and more informed response. It can even actually be used to directly improve the humanitarian system. Data can, of course, mean many things, and to improve our system, we need information on its flaws, and that, in another person's words, is data. So I think it's pertinent we ask ourselves these questions: how can we leverage technology, data, and evidence to inform humanitarian responses? But equally, how can we use it to improve the system itself without expecting it to be the silver bullet that will ultimately result in more localized, more efficient, and more kind of bespoke, individually designed humanitarian assistance, which amidst the complexity, growing numbers and diminishing funds, I think is still something that's important, the need for bespoke assistance to people based on their individual needs.
Thank you. Thank you for taking that question back. Any other final questions? Oh, good. Well, I want to thank you all very much for coming, and for those people who dialed in online. It's really great to have you here. We're going to stay, for those who can stay, there's drinks, you're very welcome to stay, talk to each other and keep the conversation going. And I want to say a big thank you to all my panelists. Thanks so much for your ideas and thoughts, and also for your positivity about this, because I'm sure there's lots of great things to come. Thanks, everybody. So many.